Hello, and welcome to Tea Time with the Jackson Center. I am Kristen McMahon, and I have the pleasure of serving as the president of the Robert H. Jackson Center in Jamestown, New York. Today's tea is sponsored by the Resource Center, making a difference in people's lives. The Resource Center's mission is to support individuals with disabilities and other challenges in achieving maximum independence, contributing to their community, experiencing lifelong growth, and enjoying quality of life. And the Resource Center has been providing services to persons with disabilities and their families in Chautauqua County since 1958. The Jackson Center's 2020 programming theme is The Other Through Your Eyes. And our programs, including these tea times, are focused on showing how the law impacts each of us differently, depending on our backgrounds and circumstances. Our goal is to create paths to understanding and increase conversation as part of our vision of a global society where the universal principles of equality, fairness, and justice prevail. I am excited to welcome today's guest to tea. Rebecca Cokley is the director of the Disability Justice Initiative at the Center for American Progress, where her work focuses mainly on disability policy. Prior to her current role, she served as executive director of the National Council on Disability, an independent agency charged with advising Congress and the White House on issues of national disability public policy. She joined the National Council on Disability in 2013 after serving in the Obama administration for 4 years, including time at the Department of Education and the Department of Health and Human Services, as well as a successful stint at the White House, where she oversaw diversity and inclusion efforts. Rebecca, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a thrill to be here.
So I think usually what we do to start these teas is sort of ground everybody. And so I think it makes sense to me, if it makes sense to you, that we start with the American with Disabilities Act.
Definitely.
And is characterizing this group as people with disabilities the right way to think about it? And I've seen in doing my research for this, I've seen some conversation about should we be even more specific with that about with regards to particular adaptive devices that people need or adaptive services that people need. So I'd love to get your thoughts on that.
I actually think like the blessing of the ADA is in how general it is and how it specifically uses a definition that focuses on, a disability is a mental or physical impairment that impacts activities of daily living, a history or record of such impairment, or the assumption of such impairment. And, so often I in engaging with folks, they're like, well, I have depression, but I don't know if it's a disability. Or someone will say, I have Crohn's and I don't know if it's a disability. And I remind them like the definition in the law is it's not a checklist of diagnoses. And that's because disability itself it's dynamic. It's not static. It doesn't stay in place. And so just as, the universal access symbol is a white dude in a wheelchair and has been for decades, whether or not that's accurate, we also count the children in Flint, Michigan, who've gone 4,000 plus days with lead contaminated drinking water. We count the 200 plus thousand people that are now considered long haulers with COVID as part of the disability community. And that's, to me, is the beauty of the definition, is the fact that it recognizes that disability evolves and changes over time.
Well, and that it sounds like almost a rarity for a law to be that forward thinking. They tend to be more specific or more static. So the fact that there is that room for growth in the ADA really shows, at least in my mind, some fairly careful crafting of the wording of that law.
Oh, definitely careful crafting. Let's also remember we're coming out of the AIDS and HIV epidemic. The massive outbreak in the 1980s. They were still actively figuring out what was going on with folks that had come back from Vietnam with PTSD and Agent Orange. We were seeing the beginning of conversations around the autistic community. And so even at that point in time that they were writing the law, there was active discussion about like who counts and who doesn't. And should we have a law where, we don't know what's going to happen in the next generation of folks that come home from war. We don't know what happens to folks that are exposed to environmental racism. We know they're impacted, but how do we write a law that's got a definition that's that elastic, that allows it to expand and contract as needed.
Well, and you touched on something a little bit there too, that I wonder how the definition of ableism plays into this discussion as well. So are we using the right lens when we're looking at this, or is there some other way we should be thinking about it?
Definitely. I think it's really interesting that ableism is actually finally being talked about for so long, because it really wasn't for a long time. And it's still often left out when people talk about forms of discrimination and forms of oppression. And I think part of that is because if you look at the media or you look at the different ways that disability is often framed, what I'll hear from my friends that are not disabled is, oh, no one discriminates against disabled people. Like, we care about disabled people. You have charities that are throwing tons of money at you. You have special parking. You can like jump the line at the airport, and it's like, yeah, we have all of those things because you all have set up a society that's not built for us. And the definition of ableism that I always use is one developed by a scholar named Talila Lewis, who defines ableism as a system that places value on people's bodies and minds based off of societally constructed ideas of normalcy, intelligence, and excellence. These ideas are deeply rooted in anti-Blackness, eugenics, and capitalism. And it's focused on whether or not people can produce, and like produce in multiple ways, whether it's like labor production, it's even like whether or not people can have children, whether people are in positions to be able to excel and be employed, and what that actually looks like. And the notion of even like behaving, like how someone behaves in public and how we regard someone's behavior in public is directly tied to the roots of ableism.
Well, that's interesting. I think that will probably be a new concept for a lot of the people who are watching today, and that not so much that society has been set up in a way that marginalizes certain people, but that there are these conventions, and we tend to think of them perhaps as manners or even just conventions that really contribute to this.
And I think it helps us unpack a lot of the complexities of issues, such as around like police violence. We know that over 50% of the folks killed by law enforcement are people with disabilities. We actually don't know the hard numbers because we actually aren't able at this moment to cross-reference data on race and data on disability.
Huh.
So we can talk about the numbers of African Americans. The Washington Post has anecdotal numbers about people of color with mental illness, but even more broadly than that, I mean, we don't know about deaf folks. We don't know about people with epilepsy, people with other neurodiverse conditions like autism, and how all of this ends up playing out. But there really is like that nexus in so many places.
Well, and this leads me to a question that I've been wondering about, because we tend to think of those of us who are not a member of the disability community tend to think of that community as fairly homogenous. And I wonder, I guess, sort of both sides of this coin, is there strength in that? Or do we also need to be reconceptualizing how we view the community?
I mean, we are probably the most diverse community on the planet. We're continually evolving and changing every day. Every time y'all do something bad to the planet, more disabled people show up and different disabled people show up. So thank you for adding to our community. And I think for us, I mean, there are certain core concepts across our community that remain important to everyone. Concepts like bodily autonomy, the right to be able to decide what's done to you, what to have a voice in the decisions tied to your body. I think probably the best pop culture reference of that is Britney Spears can't vote because she's still under conservatorship. She can't decide where she lives or how she lives because the decision, she does not have a right to bodily autonomy as per the guardianship that she's under. We have the concept of nothing about us without us, which I love hearing progressives rattle off without the acknowledgement that it actually comes out of the disability rights movement, specifically the anti-apartheid disability rights movement from South Africa.
Oh, interesting.
The notion that decisions about people with disabilities, decisions about their education, about where we live, how we exist, should not be made without us centered in those conversations. And then at the same time, there are things that are more controversial. I mean, the conversation around what we call the societal model of disability, which is that we aren't broken is that society has been constructed by a majority culture in such a way that it's inaccessible to us. And it's not us that needs to change, it's that society needs to change. And that when society changes to be more accessible for disabled people, it becomes more accessible for everyone. It's sort of the curb cut approach, or wheeled luggage, or, any sort of captions on a television, any sort of thing that was designed for us and that we fought for. In this case, let's say telework. Disabled people have been fighting for telework for 30 years and have been denied it, being told it's an unreasonable accommodation. And for everyone sitting at home right now, like I am in front of my bedroom dresser because our office is closed due to the pandemic, you're welcome. You got telework because of us. Pay a disabled person, tip your waitress. But then on the flip side, there's an acknowledgement that for some folks, a medical model, the notion that there are things that make us fundamentally ill that we need to have treated, that changing society won't fix. For me, accessing an accessible society as a person with a physical disability, I have dwarfism, is one thing. Like, I like being able to reach my ATM at my bank to put my money in and take it out. But when I have a migraine, there's nothing about fixing society that's going to fix my head.
Right.
And so I still want good drugs and treatment for migraines. If I could cure my migraines in a minute, I would. Would I want to cure my dwarfism? Never. I'm actually talking to a reporter about that this afternoon. But the acknowledgement that cognitive dissonance is okay. And that's what makes us such a diverse community, is we come with all of these different experiences and backgrounds.
Well, and that I really think is showcased nicely too, and just all of the conversations I feel like people are having around diversity these days, and certainly over basically since June, how that has ramped up, is that there is strength in groups, but that plurality of voice is also what brings new ideas to the table, or new solutions, or even just new perspectives, obviously, that help change everything, hopefully for the better.
Definitely.
And you mentioned something too that I find interesting, and I think this plays into intersectionality. And we've had a few conversations over the course of these teas where intersectionality has come up. But I find it curious that we can know how many people are the victims of police violence who are of a certain race or a certain gender, and we can know how many perhaps have a disability or some other characteristic to them, but that there's nothing that is tying those together yet. And is that another failure, seems the appropriate word, of no one's ever really thought that data needed to be gathered that way?
Definitely. I mean, I think there is a huge issue across the board on actually thinking about how our government collects data, whether it be intersecting race and disability in the law enforcement space. Also in the education space, the Secretary of Education has been under significant scrutiny because of her failure and refusal to implement a rule called the Equity and IDEA rule. And that's around significant disproportionality of students of color with disabilities in special education. So actually looking at district level data that tells us how many kids that are students of color with disabilities are identified, are placed in special education, and disciplined in the special education setting. So we can look at, is it that, are some school districts more prone to go back to actually physically segregate students of color under the label of disability, and do those students actually have disabilities or not? Is there over, or in some places even like underrepresentation? Because it is a both issue. You have students that are more likely, we know that African American students are more likely to be diagnosed as emotionally behaviorally disturbed, where a white student that exhibits the same behavior is going to be called autistic. And the types of resources and services that they get in their community are totally different based off of the stigma of those two different conditions.
Mm-hmm. Well, and then, so are there other, I'm not sure if the quite the right way to phrase this is, are there other intersectionalities that seem to disproportionately impact the members of the disability community, or is I'm not sure I'm phrasing that question correctly.
No, totally. We're starting to actually see some really interesting trend lines around LGBT identity and disability, and specifically trans identity and disability. Right now the data out of Europe tells us that roughly 30% of folks that are autistic also identify as LGBT, with a heavy emphasis on the trans side. And the US is still very puritanical in a lot of our research methods. And the notion that disabled people have gender identity or sexual identity at all is very uncomfortable to a lot of researchers, sadly. And so we don't have equitable research over here in the States. But in talking to people in both the trans and the broader LGBT community and the disability community, they suspect the number is actually higher to around 50%.
Wow. And you've mentioned a few times environmental justice, and I think you also had recently written an article that also dealt with poverty and disability. And I feel like part of this intersectionality conversation that might be new to our audience as well is just how these broader social issues also disproportionately impact the people with disabilities. So do you want to
Definitely.
talk a little bit about
You
that?
know, to us, poverty, I mean, and the research tells us that poverty is both a cause and a consequence of disability. If you grow up in poverty, you're less likely to have access to regular health care, to safe places to be outdoors, to clean water, healthy food, all of these things that we know are essential to grow up. And then if you're disabled, it's also life is significantly more expensive. We've seen some early data telling us that if you're a person with a disability in the United States, you have between $1,500 and $7,000 a year of expenses that are not covered by your health insurance, that are disability related expenses. For someone like me who's a little person, it might be getting your clothing altered because I have to pay twice as much for my clothes, and I'm not able to take those expenses off on my taxes. For somebody who uses a wheelchair, it might be that Medicaid will pay for the base wheelchair, but they need specific cushions, or they might need to have backup inner tubes for the chair. They might decide, it would be really great to be able to charge my cell phone off my wheelchair, so I need to have an outlet put in, or any number of different modifications. For some folks, it might be having an app on your phone that like speaks what you type. In this day and age, it could really vary, but it is very expensive to be a person with a disability. And if the ACA is repealed, it's going to be increasingly more expensive to be a person with a disability, because all of those disabilities are pre-existing conditions and those costs won't be covered.
Well, and another article I read recently that you wrote recently that I read also had to do with the Family and Medical Leave Act, and this seems to play in nicely to the conversation we're just having about healthcare as well. And I think one of the things I was surprised about is that the article said there were approximately 61 million people in the United States with disabilities, but only about 10% of them are in the U.S. workforce, so about 6 million. And I just found that a bit of a shocking number, that only that 10%. And I also found it surprising, I think, that the vast majority of the 6 million seem to be more in part-time work, or what we might consider probably lower income
Yeah.
jobs.
People with disabilities make up the majority of low income workers. We tend to call it the 8 F's of disability employment: food, filth, fetching, filing, flowers, folding, festive, and friendly. Like, those are the jobs that typically people with disabilities get routed to. And there's any number of reasons for it. I mean, systemic ableism is definitely part of that. Lack of access to accommodations in school translate to lack of accommodations when you start knowing what you need when you go out into the world of work. Um, Frankly, like, totally honestly, like, rampant discrimination against people with disabilities. We live in a society where the ADA is 30 years old and places still manage to be inaccessible. And so that plays out a fair amount. And I think we also live in a society where we still have a loophole in the Fair Labor Standards Act that allows roughly 200,000 people with disabilities to be paid as little as $2.15 a week, under a subminimum wage allocation. And these are all things that tie into that nexus of disability and poverty. That means that for a lot of folks with disabilities, the American dream is still not accessible to them.
When you raise an interesting point as well when you're talking about education, and I wonder then if there is also if you are perhaps the only disabled person in a community, and I recognize the likelihood of that is incredibly low given the numbers we're talking about, but I'll use perhaps a conventional thought of someone. So, the child in the wheelchair in school. And if there is no one else really in your peer group or even in your teacher level who can help you navigate and understand what it is you need to succeed,
Yeah.
how does someone learn that then? So this seems as if the system from the beginning is fraught with
Well, and
challenges.
I think so much of the conversation about the system specifically focuses on special education as a place. I think we talk about special ed as a place. It's the room over there. It's the outside trailer. It's where
Mhm.
those kids go, instead of acknowledging the fact that we know that roughly 60% of kids with disabilities spend 80% of their time in a general ed setting. And that special education is about rights. It's about access to civil rights and access to supports that students are entitled to by law as a result of their disability. It's actually why we use the term disability. I hate all the euphemisms. They weren't developed by disabled people, they were developed by non-disabled people because the word disability feels uncomfortable to them. I don't need folks to decide what we need to be called. The law says the ADA. And so we really stress it within the disability rights and justice movement, the notion of disability identity and the fact that having a disability means you have access to civil rights protections. I was talking to a good friend this last week, who's recently been diagnosed with an autoimmune disability and is dealing with the stares that she gets in public
Mhm.
and the way that she's being treated. And, and somebody was like, "Oh, but you're just special." And she's like, "There's nothing special about being followed and having people take pictures of you in public." She's like, "Believe me." And she was like, "Becca, we just have to make people get this." And to me, it really is one of those things that you can't be what you don't see reflected into yourself.
Mhm.
And I think also one of the big challenges is, who do you learn about that's disabled when you're in school? You learn about Helen Keller, and you learn and you get Helen Keller, like this much Helen Keller. You
Right.
don't get like radical badass going to South Africa to observe apartheid and push back on it. Co-founder of the ACLU, Helen Keller. You get inspiration porn, Helen
Right.
Keller.
Yep.
You don't get told that like FDR, like you get told that poor FDR picked himself up by his bootstraps. I'm sorry, FDR was rich as hell. He had it way easier than disabled people during the Depression. But still had to deal with structural ableism, still had to deal with how that played out in his family and in society. But we don't give kids examples of that so that they can see that there's anything else for them.
Well, and this seems like a good place to talk about the Disability Justice Initiative and
Definitely.
what sort of led to its founding at the Center for American Progress, and talk to us about that background.
So in 20, I was in the Obama administration from day one, from day one to like at way beyond the end, and was trying to figure out what I wanted to do next after leaving the National Council on Disability. I took a summer off because I hadn't had a summer off since I was in college. I watched a bunch of Law and Order
Nice.
marathons and like did literally nothing. It was awesome.
That sounds like an excellent choice.
Oh, it was awesome. It was very enjoyable, and was trying to figure out what I wanted to do next, and that coincided with the summer of the ACA attacks
Hmm.
and Congress trying to vote out the Affordable Care Act. And living in DC, living actually on Capitol Hill, hearing from all my friends that were coming into town for protests, it really reminded me of the strength of our community and the power of our community. And let's acknowledge the fact that disabled people saved the ACA in 2017.
Mhm.
And that's a powerful thing. And so my colleague, Rebecca Vallis, who was at the Center for American Progress at the time, and I were like, why is there no progressive home for the disability community?
Hmm.
Why is there no space in the progressive movement? Like, there is no bricks and mortar office that focuses on disability issues in the progressive space. And we shopped the idea to about 10 different CEOs of civil rights and progressive organizations. And we're told it would be too expensive, that no one would fund it, that there was no interest in it.
Hmm.
And yeah, it was like basically literally being like patted on the head and told to like go about our business, until we sat down with Neera Tandon at the Center for American Progress. And Neera was impressed by the power of the disability community. She had met with several of the protesters and was really blown away by what they were pushing, what they were able to do, and said, "Why the heck not? Like, let's build it at CAP." And so, with some seed funding from the Ford Foundation and some others, we built out our center starting in 2018. We just celebrated our second anniversary. And so we sort of have two focuses, one of which is how do we bring the progressive community to the table on disability issues? You know, and a good example would be the fight to save the ADA after HR 620 was passed in the House, which would have repealed Title III of the ADA back in 2018. You know, and mobilizing our allies across the progressive space to say, like, no, this is a progressive issue. You're not attacking our community. And then on the flip side, how do we bring the disability community to the table on progressive issues? And so a good example of that would have been the public charge fight last year. And the disability community had never weighed in on immigration reform ever, or any kind of immigration bill or proposal. And to mobilize the community in such a way, I mean, the comment campaign that we ran resulted in over 140,000 comments from the disability community.
Wow.
Talking about how the public charge would either impact them, someone they love, or a caregiver they knew. And being able to do that at a time during an election cycle meant that we also got to work with about 12 different candidates on writing disability policy platforms or including disability priorities in their platforms, which was historic. Prior to that, at the most, President Obama released his disability platform in December of 2007, ahead of the 2008 election. And at that point in this cycle, we already had 10 platforms out.
Wow. Just for a little bit of orientation, could you explain what Title III of the ADA is?
Sure. Title III of the ADA is access to public accommodations. So the ability to go out in public, the ability to go to the CVS and deal with the ungodly long receipt, the horrible customer service, to be able to buy toilet paper. That's what we're talking about with Title III. The right of disabled people to not have to plan in advance for 2 months what restaurant you want to go to, because restaurants should be accessible under the ADA. And the desire, frankly, by the big business community, even though it was framed as a small business thing, it was actually run by the Hotel and Lodging Association, to push back and actually say that instead of enforcing the ADA, what they were going to do was say that they wanted to ask for time, they weren't specific about the time, to make substantial progress. And they didn't define substantial progress. They've had 30 years to make substantial progress. I'm sorry. Like, you've had 30 years to buy a damn ramp, to widen your doorways, and you haven't done it now. If we give you time to make substantial progress, you're never going to do it. And so we were actually really thankful both to have, you know, Senator Duckworth as well as Senator Warren and a number of new voices in the Senate put their foot down and be like, no, we're not letting this bill come over to the Senate. We're not doing this.
Well, and so that actually naturally leads me into when you and I were having our initial conversations about setting up time for us to chat and have this conversation. One of the things you had asked is if we could wait until after the election, because there was a lot of preparation that I'm assuming your initiative was working on leading up to the election. And so I also want to talk a little bit about what are some of your concerns, or what were some of your concerns if the president was elected to a second term? And then also, what are some of your concerns, or what are some of the things you plan on working with if President Biden is actually certified as the winner of this election?
You know, I think you can't have a conversation about our current times without talking about COVID. And the president's lack of response around COVID has led to this huge boom in the disability population, at the same time that he and his administration and his friends in Congress are actively attacking the social safety net. So at this time that we're ending up with so many more disabled people, they're choosing to go after Social Security, make it harder to get benefits, pass tax cuts that actually will bankrupt the Social Security Trust. 3 rounds of attacks on nutrition programs, of which 30% of applicants for SNAP are disabled people or have disabled people in their households. We have been the canary in the coal mine of this administration since day one. Every attack they've proposed has largely started with disabled people or trans folks or immigrants. Like, we joke among our three communities, we're always, if we could be in space together, we'd be like the three kids that like are sitting together in the back of the class because we're like in a pack, maybe they won't see us. And no, they always call us out because they're like, we want you, you, and you, get out. And so there's been a real, our folks are struggling. Our folks, we started counting we knew our death tolls would increase the minute we saw the news on the pandemic. We knew that our folks would be hardest hit. And they have been. 2/3 of deaths are tied to the nursing home industrial complex. Most people just think of nursing homes as having old people. They don't. In Florida, there are 20,000 children living in nursing homes. And these are the folks that are dying. And so I think for us, the Trump administration, it's been a non-negotiable since day one. With the exception of one piece of guidance that came out of the Office of Civil Rights around saying that you couldn't discriminate in organ transplants of people with disabilities. There has not been a single good thing that's come out of the Trump administration for the disability community. And so I think, for the Biden administration, we have a disabled president. Let's just sit with that for a minute, who's very open about the fact he has a disability. Watching him in the debates was fascinating to me as a disabled person, because I was, people were like, he's taking a long time to answer. Mm-hmm. He's being slow, slow Joe. And to me, I knew what he was doing. He was accommodating his stutter. He was stopping and thinking ahead of time, what is it I need to say? And what are the words and the techniques that I need to do to accommodate myself to get there? Yep. And that was really cool. Like, that to me as a disabled policy wonk was like, yeah, I see that. Like, I don't always like necessarily how it's framed by the media, but I really see it. And I acknowledge what he's doing. Where he was the last candidate to develop a disability policy platform. And so it took a lot of pulling and pushing and pulling from a lot of us in the advocacy community saying, come on, we created a hashtag called Access to Joe. And it was like, come on, Joe, we're waiting here. We know you have something, like, give us your policy. But the benefit of that was that he was able to learn from all the policies that have been put up before. And so, Vice President-elect Kamala Harris was the first person to put out a policy platform. And it was really short and succinct and focused on education and economic development. And then, we go from that to, Senator Warren, who had Senator Warren, Secretary Castro, and Pete Buttigieg, who all had really comprehensive platforms. And then, frankly, our dear friend Bernie Sanders, Senator Sanders, who had an everything and the kitchen sink and a patio set. Like, you felt like you were almost watching Let's Make a Deal, where you keep getting the bigger prizes, in reading Senator Sanders' platform, because everything was in there. I was looking at stuff and I was like, I didn't even realize X thing was an issue, and I've done this for 20 years. But President-elect Biden was able to pull from all of that. And so there's a benefit to that, which was really great.
It also sounds to me a little bit as if there is a lot more education that needs to be done outside of the disability community, because I think, to your point about during the debates, President-elect Biden working through his stutter issues, I think for a lot of people, they don't recognize that as a disability. So in their mind, because I can just think through the number of conversations I've been having with people about, again, he seemed slow, he seemed addled. I think even one of my friends said, I know what dementia looks like, and that's it. And I'm having these conversations of, no, he has this, he's working through it. And this is how it's manifesting itself. So there is a lot of education that needs to be done.
Well, and I think it's also people owning the spaces that they have a right to be in. I think a lot about, it's funny, I think a lot about Dick Clark and New Year's Eve. And after Dick Clark had the stroke, and people watching my progressive friends be like, I don't want to watch someone like that on my TV. Oh my God. And I was like, you know what? Who is better at doing New Year's Eve than Dick Clark? And I was like, waiting. Who has performed the essential functions of the job better than Dick Clark over the last however many years? I was like, here is a person that is the utmost qualified person to do this thing in the country. And you're saying he shouldn't be able to do it because you're uncomfortable. And it was really interesting because a lot of my friends were like, I never thought about that. And I was like, sure, Seacrest can come out of here, and Seacrest is learning this. Like, this is a good example of mentorship, but he has the right. So what does it say that we as a society are willing to tell someone who is uniquely, supremely qualified to do the job that they're doing and has done it for years, that we don't want them to do it anymore because it makes us uncomfortable?
Mm-hmm. Well, and that again seems to play into a lot of the conversations I feel like we're having these days of it's not somebody else's job to make us feel comfortable.
Oh yeah.
So, it's challenging, but we also need those people to point out when we're having those conversations, when our discomfort is prohibiting something that should happen.
And it's also just important. I mean, one of the things that Senator Duckworth says that I love, that she and I joke about, is the importance of acknowledging the suck. Like, there are days it really sucks. There are days that you're like, I really don't want to have to educate everyone in my life about X thing.
Yeah.
And I think for a lot of folks, it's important to like actively be able to acknowledge that. It's like, there are days that it's all right, and there are days that it really sucks, and that's okay.
And I think in terms of, from my personal reaction, I also have to be okay with you telling me today's not the day for this. Like,
Yeah.
I do not have it in me today to educate you on this. Come back and talk to me some other day. But for right now, you're going to have to figure this out on your own.
I told somebody recently, I was like, Google's a great tool. And they were like, what? And I was like, Google's a great tool. And I was like, if I was not in a work setting and I was consulting, I could bill you $500 an hour for like the dwarfiantation I'm going to give. But I don't want to. I was like, you know what? Google's a great tool. Like, find your way to it, and I'll be happy to have this conversation later. But like, this is not our job.
Mm-hmm. And this leads me a little bit to, again, part of my research. And this is one of the reasons why I love these teas, is that I get to educate myself fairly rapidly sometimes, but on a variety of issues. And one of the things that struck me, because honestly, I just had never thought about it in this way before, is microaggressions within this community as well. I'm very familiar with the microaggressions in the racial context conversation. But I was reading an article about, saying something like, do you say you have a standing meeting? Is it like, and it's just sort of things like that. So I want to talk a little bit about this as well, because I feel like this will also be a new concept for a lot of people.
It really varies. I mean, I think language is so interesting because I remember talking to a friend of mine, like when I was at the National Council on Disability, we got into a conversation about, I don't remember what term it was. I think it was like blind date, and like, is blind. And so I was like, well, let's reach out to blind Twitter. And it's like, hey, blind Twitter, thoughts about the phrase like blind date? Is it okay? Is it not okay? And there wasn't even consensus in the blind community at that point in time about the phrasing. So I think it really varies. I mean, I think there's any number of things. One of the things that makes me laugh is when I go into an accessible restroom and I might use an accessible stall to be able to use the railings. And then the purse hook is at like 5'11". And I like my purses. I buy expensive purses. I don't want to put my purse on the ground. And I like sit there and I'm like, okay, how am I, like, this is a disabled stall and like the purse hook is at like 5'11". This is exciting. I think there's things like that. I mean, I think there is the number of times like I've pulled into an accessible parking spot and like hopped out of my van and like been yelled at and accosted by old people that are like, you can't park there, you're just short. And I'm like, you're just old, which I know is not the right thing to say, but they get me in the wrong moment sometimes. I was like, microaggression with microaggression, but like dealing with that, or talking to my kids about it. Like I was talking to somebody last night who's a disabled mom who was saying to me how she's been cutting back on going to her kids' public events because people stare at her and make comments at her. And I was like, so it's just easier not to show up. And she was like, yeah. I was like, okay, no, you can't do that. I was like, we got to have a conversation about this. But the reality, and I was like, so have you talked to the school about the fact this is creating a hostile environment for your kid? Like, you can't participate as a mom in these spaces because of the discrimination you're dealing with. And it's a school, it happens on school grounds. So the school needs to deal with it. And like, and I said, when my son started school, we wrote a letter home to all the parents. And I debated it. Like, my parents didn't do that. Both my parents were little also. Um, and so I spent a lot of time having to answer questions in class. And so we wrote a letter in advance to all the kids all the parents of the kids in his kindergarten class. And it was like basic stuff because some of it's safety stuff. It's like, no, do not pick him up. He is like, yes, he is 5. Yes, he has the right to be in your class. Yes, he's the size of a 2-year-old. Don't pick him up. That's not safe. Like, don't call him a baby. Like these sorts of things. And we articulated it through with him. We actually talked about it with him because we were like, do you like when people call you baby? No. Okay, we'll write that in here. Like, what else do you not like? He's like, I don't want people to move my stool. If I have my stool somewhere and they move my stool, like that's not okay because I need that to learn. And it was interesting because I don't know if anybody followed one of the numerous White House whistleblower cases this year. I guess it was last year, tied to Jared's security clearance.
Mhm.
His security clearance was done by another redheaded little person, not me, another redheaded little person in the White House. And she started dealing with retaliation because she came forward about the
Oh,
pressure she was
interesting.
under. And they did things like they moved the lock on her office door so she couldn't reach the lock.
Gosh.
They moved the files in the cabinet that she had used for 10 plus years into the top file so she couldn't actually do her job. And so then when she had her review, she was penalized for not doing her job and like had written down a litany of the microaggressions she had dealt with. And like we had coffee one day and we were talking about it and she was like, literally, it felt like I was on the playground in like 3rd grade. And a lot of times, like, that's the kind of like people are like, oh, people don't really do that. No, that actually really happens. Like, I remember being told I should be grateful in a job because our office had been redesigned and I could actually reach the printers. And like the CEO was like, you should, and like bend over and was like, you should just be so grateful. Look, you can reach the printers now. And I was like, yeah, like your old office was built before 1990. You just ignored the law. But I mean, I think there is a lot of stuff like that disabled people have to deal with that, unless you witness it, um, folks don't realize. I mean, I remember having conversations with the Secret Service at the White House and them saying to me that they never realized how much harassment I dealt with until I was walking in front of Pennsylvania Avenue in front of the White House. And they were like, you got like people grab you. And I was like, yeah, people grab me. And I was like, this is the first job I've had where it's someone else's job to make sure that people don't grab me. It's really nice. I was like, I'm going to be spoiled for life. But like people don't, and I want to be very clear, it's also exacerbated at the intersections of like race and gender. Like disabled women have to deal with being fetishized and hypersexualized. Disabled people of color have to deal with being treated as suspects everywhere they go. And so there's a lot of privilege. There's also privilege in the space about whether or not you have an apparent disability. As
Mhm.
people won't question my request for accommodations because they're like, oh, if you're short, of course you need a stool. But somebody who has a mental illness and asks to be able to accommodate their schedule around their therapist appointment, someone might be like, oh, you're not really crazy. Or, oh, everyone sees a therapist. You don't need time off to do that. And so there are like different dimensions of how privilege plays out in the space too.
Well, and that, I think all of this, so sort of multiple thoughts in my head here. A lot of this seems to come back around to how do we better educate people who are outside of the disability community in order to sensitize them to this. Because I just think, no one of regular size would ever really go up and grab somebody else of regular size and like try to walk away with them or something like that.
Oh
Like
yeah.
that's just not something they would do.
Women's
Um,
March, I got grabbed 37 times at the Women's March by people that were like, where's your mommy? And I was like, excuse me?
yeah.
And it was just like, I'm like, don't touch, like, I wouldn't touch someone else's kid. I might talk to them if I saw them and I thought they were by themselves. But yeah, no, there is a real lack of understanding of like just teaching people, like treating people like they have a baseline level of humanity.
Mhm. All right, so we're going to open it up to questions now. And we do actually have one question from Sean already. So, what would be 3 things that people outside of the community could do that would make the most impact for the disabled community, in your opinion? And that really could be from any perspective: political, interpersonal, community.
Hire disabled people. hire disabled people. Be thoughtful about, if you have like a DEI, a disability equity and inclusion strategy, like think about how disability is included in that. Like one of the things, like we actually literally worked with political candidates on getting comfortable even just saying the word disability, because they weren't. The only person that was, frankly, was Mayor Buttigieg, because he has had senior staff people with a variety of disabilities on his team for years. And I remember he was like, "Oh no, I got this, disability, disability, disability." And other candidates had a hard time, and so we literally had to teach people how to basically like Wonder Woman stance it out. It's like, stand there, put your hands on your hips, talk about the diversity categories you engage with. Okay, people of color, women, LGBT folks, immigrants, disability. Okay, now this time put disability second. Okay, this time put disability third, and actually like train behaviorally how to talk about it. And so that was a bit like that, and that moves into the notion of like you can't be what you don't see. And so like making sure that like it's included in how you talk about diversity, making sure if you have photos on your website that you include folks with disabilities, not just as recipients of service though, which is what we get a lot, but like show a person with a disability at the head of the boardroom table, show somebody using a sign language interpreter and standing behind a podium. Show disabled people in relationship with each other and with non-disabled people, which is hard for a lot. Like people don't think about how that little stuff matters, but it really does. And moving into the notion of like actively like hiring disabled, like as you said, like the unemployment numbers for disabled people are abysmal. They've been solidly at 70% for the last decade plus. And I think part of it is also moving from the notion of it's just about a job to the notion of it's about a career. Like, why is it non-disabled people have the right to a career, and for disabled people, we can just have a job?
Yeah, that makes sense. All right, we have a question from Helena. Because disabilities come in so many forms, what employment policies would you suggest should be common practice?
Um, like I said, like actively like part of it is like as a company, like actively talking about it, having it included. I think being very open to conversations around accommodations. Like I ask from the first interview when I'm interviewing somebody for a job, my first email to them is, please let us know if you require any accommodations to participate. It should never be the onus should never be on the disabled person to have to ask for access. Like it should be something you think about from the beginning. I think being really flexible at how you think about like what work looks like for people with disabilities, really boiling down to what are the essential functions of the job. I have a staff person right now who lives in Utah and is getting their PhD, and is a full-time contractor, but gets the work done. And in this virtual space, like you're able to be so much more flexible, which works for a lot of folks with disabilities. And so how are we taking advantage of the time that we're in and telework, to be able to bring more folks with disabilities on staff? And I think, just talking about it the same way you talk about any diverse community.
Do you find that disability still, and I was thinking through your conversation of teaching people to get comfortable with the word, is it still sort of a whispered word that then, when people are like, oh yeah, they have a disability. And so, and
Totally.
that's, yeah.
Very much
And,
so.
and that's part of the challenge with, it's like you have red hair and I have hazel eyes, they have a disability. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think honestly, I think that's why the experience of my friend David Johns, who runs the National Black Justice Coalition, doesn't talk about coming out anymore. He talks about inviting in, and the notion of inviting people into your truths. And I think there's a real power behind people in leadership inviting people into their experiences, people with disabilities, and it doesn't often happen. But we know that roughly 25% of the population are disabled. So chances are there's someone in the management of your organization that has a disability, and talking about it. Being open about the fact, like I'm very open about the fact that I'm a little person. I also have started talking more about the fact that I live with anxiety, because I learned when I talk about it, it makes my staff more comfortable talking to me about what they're living with. It makes me a better boss because I have a better understanding of what my team is going through. But it's also one of those things that I've realized as someone in like senior leadership in a progressive space, being out about who I am means that people will tell me like quite literally, I'm 6 months in a job and then people start coming out to me, or people start inviting me in, or people will be like, hey, my kid has an IEP problem. Can you help me think through it? And so I think part of it, there is a real opportunity for, and I challenge my friends that are in senior leadership who have disabilities, who aren't public about it, to be like, out yourself, see what happens. Just do it one time in a public speech. See what the result is. And, I had a colleague who had just gotten their 20-year chip for AA and was giving a speech on immigration rally. And I was like, why are you out about your AA, about your alcoholism, but you're not out about your depression? And I was like, we're in the middle of the Trump administration. Your kids are being locked in cages. What would happen if you talked about your depression? And he was like, is that a bet? And I was like, yeah, like, I'll bet you $20. Go up there and talk about your depression. And when he came off the stage, he was flooded by like 100 young people who were like, I didn't know I could be a leader of this movement and be depressed.
Wow. We have a question from Dominic. He says, hello, first and foremost. And then how do we educate people on what ableism is?
I think you talk about it when you see it. You point it out. When someone, a great example that we've actually talked about a lot in the workplace has been the language being used to describe the current resident of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, and how people were very quick to be like, he's crazy, throw him in the loony bin. That's ableist language. That language is harmful. Nobody has formally diagnosed him. We can think he has whatever. But being able to use that and criminalize it and say that someone's unfit for leadership because of that isn't fair. We've had disabled presidents do amazing things in this country before. And it also then makes it that much harder for people in our world to feel comfortable coming out. Nobody wants to be compared to that guy. Let's be real. And so, we had to have a conversation across our organization talking about how we talk about the current president on social media. And it had to be a conversation where I was like, you guys don't realize, I know that there are people in like half of your team that live with mental illness.
Right.
And every time you use ableist terminology to talk about the president, you make them feel bad. You make them feel like that's part of themselves that they can't bring to the table. So pointing it out when you see it, pointing out the way, whether it's the terminology we use, whether it's cracking jokes about short buses, whether, there's any number of things. Most insults in our modern world are derived from disability terminology.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Right, we have a question from Daryl, who says that he has worked with a couple of people with disabilities who could definitely have benefited or definitely use the ADA to help them address their challenges in their job, but they refused to do that. So either they wouldn't admit that they had their disability, or they thought it would make them not equal in some way. So he asked, how does your center or how does the initiative respond to things like that?
We often to us, it's an exercise in rights, and you always have the right whether or not to disclose, and you can't take that away from somebody. If someone chooses not to accommodate themselves and they struggle in their job as a result of it, like, I'm not gonna lie, like, I've had to fire employees before who were people with disabilities, or people I'm pretty sure have disabilities. They may have outed themselves or come out about it later, but at the time were not out. And, didn't know about the accommodations they had available, or just refused to use them. I think part of it is talking about making your workplace as inclusive as possible to plant the seed so that people feel comfortable talking about these things. But at the same time, if someone chooses not to access their civil rights protections, like, there's nothing you can really do about that.
We're nearing the end of our time with you, so I want to be respectful of that. I think maybe absent some additional questions coming in from our audience, I'm going to start with one of my two wrap-up questions. And of course, if we get another audience question, I will ask that. But I think the first question is, what do you wish people who were outside the community understood about the disability community?
That There's a couple of things. I think even if you're outside, you're still touched by disability. 1/3 of households has a person with a disability. It's 1/4 of the population. So if it's not you, it's your mom who's a breast cancer survivor, your best friend from college who's dealing with COVID, your cousin who has an autistic kid. So you're never far from disability. I don't like a lot of times people will be like, well, you can become disabled at any part of your lifetime. I don't like using disability as a threat. I think that's really ugly and really nasty. And believe me, there's certain people that we would prefer not to have in our community, just as any other marginalized community. But I do think that it's the notion that, you know, things that are being done to disabled people are not distinct and far from you at all. Often they're within 6 to 18 inches of you. And whether it's access to programs and services, whether it's like physical access to a space. And it really matters, and every person's voice in making the world more accessible and more inclusive really can have a difference.
All right. And then I suppose the flip side of that, with all of the work that you're doing, and it actually doesn't need to be necessarily even in the work that you're doing, what do you wish the disability community was more involved in or worked on more?
It's been really interesting because I've seen us weighing in on stuff in a way that I haven't before. Whether, like I said, I brought up the immigration case, the immigration issues, um, weighing in on, like, we have some real tough issues. I mean, abortion is a real controversial issue in the disability community. And the conversations around Amy Coney Barrett, and before that, the conversations around Judge Kavanaugh. Judge Kavanaugh ruled that disabled women could be forced to have abortions without their knowledge and against their will, in a case in DC. And abortion and reproductive health care in general is one of those things that is very taboo in the disability space. And part of it is just the notion of sexuality and disability at all, and sexual health and disability at all, is taboo.
Hmm.
I know so many kids with disabilities that were pulled out for special ed because their parents didn't want them to know about sex. And we now live in a day and age where, because of the ADA, folks with disabilities have been able to get out into society, meet people, have families. But yet in 20 states, you can lose custody of your child solely on the basis of a disability diagnosis. And so there's still so much work to do around, like, actually getting to a place of equality for us.
Well, and thank you for giving a nice little teaser for 2021's programming theme for the Jackson Center as well. So I would like to thank our audience for joining us today. I hope this tea has provided food for thought. Thank you again to the Resource Center for sponsoring today's tea. And Rebecca, of course, thank you so very much for your thoughts and this discussion. It's been really great.
Thank you so much for having me.
We're going to have a little bit of a tea time break because of the Thanksgiving holiday. So the next time you can join me for tea will be on Thursday, December 3rd. We're going to look at what justice means, or what's happening in justice at the local, national, and international level. We're going to use this as part of our lead in to our 2021 programming theme, which is the work left to do, as Rebecca set me up very nicely to announce. So look forward to seeing all of you on December 3rd. And Rebecca, thank you again so very much.
Thank you so much for having me.